Chris, would you like to give us your TripAdvisor review of your short trip to Canada for the G7?
Yeah, bears, elks.
Did you see a bear?
No, I didn't.
So it was more like the threat of a bear.
No, but there was... So one of the team from number 10 did see a massive bear known locally as the Boss. And for good reason, because the little video was sent round on our one of our trip WhatsApp groups, and I was showing this to Alex on our way to the recording here, and this was quite a beast, wandering across the golf course where we were doing the interviews with the Prime Minister. And there was a chipmunk type thing that was running around at the Prime Minister's feet midway through an interview with Rob. A bit less frightening.
It sounds like a Disney film.
Yeah, I know.
He's got like a little animal helper now.
And I've not been to the Rockies before. There's a good reason why they're called the Rockies, you know. So no, an incredible backdrop for one of these things, and because it just confronts you every time you step out the door. And then a lot of international diplomacy with them, you know, backdrop of what's going on in the Middle East dominated.
Which we'll come on to. Faisal, would you like to give us your travel review of going down the HS2 tunnel?
Yes, in anticipation of a news-packed infrastructure strategy, which may not quite have come to pass. I was taken actually to the HS2, the tunnel opening north of the Chiltern Hills. So they built this very expensive, famous tunnel. It is an incredible feat of engineering, and they finished it. And I was like, you know, you hear all the stories. I'm like, this is a massive.
It's not going to open until 2033.
No, well, 2035 actually. Now that was the news from Wednesday. But it was so tall. And I said, could that fit a double-decker train? And of course, we don't have double-decker trains. And I think the vibe was that it might have been spec'd so they could have fitted a double-decker, even though it's never going to happen. Yeah. But it shows just a little example. When you go down there, you see how gold-plated it was.
But
as in high spec.
They'll just be glad to get any train on it at any point.
Yeah,
relatively
in 10
soon
years'
at this
time.
point, right? Yeah.
Can't wait.
Yeah, the fact that 2035 is the year and not like the time it's leaving. Right, although it wouldn't be funny if the first train is at 8:30. Right, Alex, would you like to review any locations for
Well, I've been in
us?
Westminster. It's been pretty sweaty.
Yeah.
How's that?
And I've just been here.
Oh, good aircon.
In the air-conditioned
Good aircon, yes.
Newscast HQ.
Right, let's air some news on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Chris in the Newscast studio.
And it's Alex also in the studio.
And Faisal in the studio.
Right, so obviously there's a huge, big international story happening with Israel's strikes on Iran and their retaliation. And just before we started recording this episode of Newscast on Thursday evening, the White House said that basically Donald Trump is going to give himself sort of 2 weeks to think about whether he will intervene on Israel's side and strike Iran. So I don't know if you call that breathing room or more time for the world to be stressed about it, but I thought maybe we just look at kind of the British, how it looks from a British angle rather than speculating about it on a global scale. Chris, I mean, you saw this firsthand in Canada with like the leaders of the 7 richest countries grappling with the crisis in real time.
Completely.
I mean, what was it like?
Trying to grapple with it in real time, and that's really code for trying to work out what Donald Trump thinks and what he might do next, which is exactly where we're at. And
he left.
Well, he left. Yeah, no, exactly. And right now, as we record, you know, the Donald Trump strategy, as is so often the case, really, is overt. It is out there, which is to say, well, I might do this, but I might do that. And so to sow an element of confusion, yes, for Iran and Iranians, yes, for the British government and every other government, and then for the world at large. But it presents a massive, massive question mark for the government here, which is, well, what do you do? What do you do when you have this good relationship with America that the Prime Minister's been really keen to cultivate, where that phone call could come at any moment from the White House, where Donald Trump says to Keir Starmer, so are you with us then? And then there's a practical consequence of that. For instance, if they want to use the air base in Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, much talked about in the context of the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands in the last few months. What is the legal advice the government is getting? So Tim Shipman, newly ensconced at the Spectator magazine, reporting that the Attorney General has concerns about the UK playing any role in this except for defending our allies. That the line from government is not to say anything, but they don't seem to be running away from that reporting from Tim. And then you've got a political argument that has all sorts of parallels with 20 years ago in the Iraq War. And of course, some of the issues are similar. When you heard the argument then about, as they were described, weapons of mass destruction. You've got the Liberal Democrats saying publish the legal advice and making that parallel with 2 decades ago. You've got the Conservatives saying there should be a far more overt strategy of acknowledging that Israel is an ally and this is a democracy that needs to defend itself and the UK should be willing to help defend it. So, I mean, I'll pause there so I don't witter on too long, but that's the essence of the dilemma that the government is now confronting.
And let's hear Keir Starmer talking about his position on this on Thursday morning.
There's a real risk of escalation here that will impact the region, possibly beyond the region, into Gaza. And obviously it's already having an impact on the economy. So I've been absolutely clear. We need to de-escalate this. Yes, the nuclear issue has to be dealt with, but it's better dealt with by way of negotiations than by way of conflict. And therefore, our clear objective here is to de-escalate this situation.
Alex, interpret that word de-escalation. Is that just the sort of thing that a Prime Minister always says in an international crisis? Or is this more
Well, that's certainly what Keir Starmer's been saying all week. So this was like a repeated call for de-escalation, which has been his consistent position throughout all of this uncertainty. But I think what was really interesting about the timing of that clip we just heard from Keir Starmer, that came before we heard from the White House that Donald Trump was going to take this 2 weeks. And before the White House press secretary said that's because they thought there was scope for negotiation with Iran. So Keir Starmer there is speaking in the context, and very carefully speaking in the context, of what was at that moment a very publicly undecided Donald Trump who was weighing up whether or not he was going to join Israel with these strikes against Iran. And the message I think I took from that was very clear from Keir Starmer, saying not so much the de-escalation, but negotiation is better than conflict in this. And I don't think you can get away from what he's saying there. He didn't want to be in a position, was my reading, where the UK was having to make the decision for all of the reasons that Chris outlined. And that has been a very clear, consistent message from Keir Starmer.
And it's interesting because, Chris, your reference to Diego Garcia, the military base, and whether the B-2 stealth bombers that would be the only plane that could carry the bunker-busting bomb that would attack the Iranian underground nuclear facility, that to me seemed like people getting quite ahead of themselves about what was it. That's the sort of thing where it sounds like military action is imminent in the next 2 hours, not potentially a decision being made in the next 2 weeks, which should go in completely the other direction.
Sure, and that gets, I think, to an element of the psychology for the leaders when they were meeting at the G7, trying to make an argument publicly around how they would like to see this resolved, but also aware that in so doing they can be making an argument that may or may not help persuade the president in their direction. So the other afternoon, when we were interviewing the Prime Minister one after another as political editors, and the Prime Minister was doing his whole de-escalation argument, he was saying, look, the night before when they'd been having the dinner with the leaders and Donald Trump was still there, he was constantly pointing to the G7 declaration that talked about the importance of de-escalation, that suggested the president had made no suggestion that escalation was imminent or on his mind. Now, that was instantly overtaken by events with that whole flurry of stuff that he was putting on social media about surrender now and all the rest of it. But in the context of what he's now saying, this is still a live consideration. And of course, the Prime Minister knows, and Donald Trump knows, that the president, faces the internal political dilemma within the so-called MAGA movement about whether intervention in a potential forever war is something that he would want to do. He got through his first term without doing it. Plenty within his broader movement really, really do not want this to happen. So he faces a dilemma too, and talking about 2 weeks buys time for an alternative solution to potentially come about.
Because, of course, you've got to remember that there were active conversations between the US and Iran before those attacks by Israel, and they were due to resume and then didn't because of everything that happened subsequently.
Faisal, one of the other things that Keir Starmer mentioned in that clip that we played there was that we're already feeling the economic impacts. Just kind of deconstruct that for us, like what those impacts actually are.
Yeah, I mean, most obviously seen in the crude oil price, which is up about 10% since the Israeli action on Iran started, which is significant, which will be felt in petrol pumps in a few weeks' time. But I think in context is probably, given what we're seeing, and it is just worth stepping back. We're seeing Tehran and Tel Aviv swap direct missile hits. It's absolutely extraordinary.
We sort of get used to it quite quickly, don't we?
Yeah. I mean, and you sort of think in the context of, if you'd asked me a month ago even, let alone 3-6 months, a year ago, what would happen to the oil price if the Israelis and the Iranians were targeting missiles at each other's major cities? And I would have said, well, you'd have had $150 a barrel oil, and that is an oil shock. You'd have had an oil shock.
And where is it today?
And it's just under 80. It's about
Right.
77, 78, depends which measure you use. And the parallels with the 1970s, where you had two different geopolitical shocks. You had the Arab-Israeli war, you had the Iranian Revolution. And when you have two shocks that were inflationary, the inflation hangs around, becomes all sticky. People become used to it, they expect it, and it creates a shock that is more than the sum of the parts. So with Russia, Ukraine, and with this, it wasn't looking great. Having said that, the dynamics in the oil market are huge oversupply. So it's just being kept in check, and it's also being kept. It's actually totally entwined with the politics, the diplomacy, the military calculus, because clearly Iran's option here is to internationalise by cutting off the strait that in the Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz, very, very small distance, 25 miles, and through that strait travels a fifth of oil, something like a quarter of liquefied natural gas. Not so important right now in a very hot summer, but very important for winter.
And by internationalise, you mean that would be Iran making their fate everyone else's business?
Yeah, suddenly it gets very, very, very serious and tangible for the entire world. There's interesting debates about who that affects the most. It affects China more than it might affect the West, more than America certainly. Would affect the price of oil and gas. I mean, you would get a shock, but they have sort of held back from that. And they've held back from targeting, any other countries, nations, the Gulf. You hear the odd sort of threat come through. So it seems to be the markets, astonishingly, given the scenes we're seeing, think that this can be contained. And probably the news we've just heard is more in the direction of not yet escalation. The pathway to an epic and economically highly material shock is extremely clear. Just that everyone seems to think that it won't get there. And they're taking an astonishingly kind of
Are they taking that
attitude.
thing that you introduced me to that's called hopium?
Yeah,
Which is not an illegal
I mean,
substance.
I don't
It's
know,
the thing where
it
people
certainly
in
sounds
the
like one.
markets kind of want to believe the best
That's a
case
great
scenario.
word.
No, I think there is.
Basically, you sound like a finance bro wherever you mention it to
No,
somebody. They think that you're fabulously wealthy or like a great analyst of equities.
I think there is a bit of that around, but clearly the economic angle here is part of the weaponry, as it were, and indeed, if any move was made on shutting off the straits, that would be part of a wider escalation, I imagine, where it might not be the top story, but I'll put it very lightly. I'm intrigued, though, as to, you talked about the parallels with Iraq. I mean, what would the UK offer in this? I mean, clearly with Iraq, we're not talking about a ground invasion.
No.
We're talking about some bombers dropping
It's a
some
fair
bombs.
question. This is an important caveat with those parallels. There's three elements, I suppose, where the UK can decide whether or not it's going to get more involved. So one would be the parallels. The two big picture parallels with Iraq are one, legal advice, and two, a country apparently in the process of developing, weapons of mass destruction, but how close are they to being able to be used? So that's in big picture terms. Where the parallels clearly break down is about the scale. The dilemmas the government has is, do you get involved in defending Israel from attack from Iran? There is a precedent for that. The UK has done that recently.
But not this time round.
But not this time round. So that's point number one. Point number two is, do you get involved at any level in assisting America should it take the decision to get involved in attacking Iran? And the crux of that at the moment, the most obvious example of that would be the use of the runways on Diego Garcia. I think I said 3 points, and I can only think of two.
Well, they're also talking about, just to add that, potentially refueling or using British bases, British assets as refueling points in Cyprus or something like that, which is at that point around a potential assistance to the US.
Because the alternative is to say no to those things when you want to maintain a decent relationship with Washington, but then you've got your own internal management of not just public opinion here, but the view on within the Labour Party.
I think it's obviously dangerous to draw the direct comparison because the practicalities and the specifics of the situation are clearly different. But I think in a purely political sense, there is an inevitable echo when you sort of see, the question about how far you go along with America in that kind of context. And that echo sits quite heavily on that.
Does it reach
Labour
the threshold of like a vote in Parliament? Something like that.
Well,
I mean, maybe it's not.
Good question.
It's not the same as like troops on the ground.
No, and to be clear, it's not obligatory for a government to ever do that in advance. There is the capacity for them to do that at their own prerogative. But the question will absolutely be asked.
Well, it already came up in Prime Minister's questions, where you already started to see from opposition MPs specifically saying how involved is Parliament going to be if, and of course it is a big if there does come some sort of involvement in some capacity.
And that echo you refer to, Alex, runs to ministers. You have ministers who will say privately, particularly those who were around a long time, 20 years ago, oh, blimey, there's parallels there, even though it's absolutely right to point out where the differences are.
And Chris, from being in Canada and seeing all the big beasts together, does it look like Keir Starmer has got a better in with Donald Trump than everyone else? Kind of hard to judge,
it is
especially when we got a trade deal signed that everyone else didn't as well.
Yeah, I mean, so outwardly, it does look like the relationship between the Prime Minister and the President is, given that they are vastly different characters and of vastly different political instinct, is as good as the Prime Minister could hope it to be, really. And just again, outwardly, you compare that moment with the reveal of the trade arrangement and all the papers ending up on the floor and all of that with the president being on a plane a few hours later and then publicly slagging off the president of France. So outwardly you compare those two things, and yes, it does appear that relationship is as good as they could hope it to be. There's an awareness in government. There's a pride that it is as good as it is. There's also an awareness that because it's Donald Trump, it could just change at any moment.
Yeah. And Faisal, just going back to the moment of Trump dropping his papers on the ground and Keir Starmer kneeling down to pick them up, and then everyone interpreting that photo and however they wanted to do it. When actually it is just a photo of one person helping another person pick up some papers. And the papers were the prosperity deal between the US and the UK. Are people celebrating that deal for the British economy, or is it just more like a sort of sigh of relief? Or
I think it's welcome relief more than it is the pathway to future mass prosperity. I think when you add up the increments of all the different deals that have been signed, and and if the government can back it up with a message that the past 9 or 10 months have been a bit sluggish, getting off the ground, setting out their stall in terms of the economy. There's quite a powerful phrase that people like the Business Secretary, Trade Secretary Johnny Reynolds uses: "We're the most connected economy. We're going to be the most connected economy in the world." And in an atmosphere of total turmoil in the trading system, and I don't know how they're going to manage to do that layered on top of potential ructions in the oil market. July the 9th is when the Trump tariffs apparently get reset for the rest of the world. Then you can say, well, actually, our cars, or 100,000 of our cars, yes, they face a 10% tariff, but that's a lot better than a BMW coming from Germany. Actually, they don't get imported from Germany, but whatever. You see what I mean? A German car going to America, which is facing 25%. There's still some things to be sorted out with steel. But I think you can start to make a case that we are insulated. But I think with other strategies, infrastructure we had today, we've got industrial next week, trade, there's an NHS 10-year plan. There is an opportunity, I think, for them to sort of mark out a path, to sort of shine a light and say, listen, come. There are things to see in Britain, there are things to invest in. We can offer things that other countries can.
And on that deal, the thing that ministers will constantly come back to, and the Prime Minister said this out loud, is about Jaguar Land Rover, and that the fears that there were about their plant in Solihull and surrounding plants in the West Midlands. A couple of other things on trade. One is, I was speaking to someone plugged into all of this who was saying a massive, it's where so many of our conversations come back to Donald Trump, a massive factor in getting the India deal over the line, which is the most conventional, if you like, free trade agreement of the three that we talk about alongside US and EU, was Donald Trump. So the negotiations accelerated massively in February because, so said the person I was talking to, the perception in Delhi that this is an era of turbulence and you've got to do deals with people who you can trust
Strike while they are
and rely on. And then a quick line about the whole business of the papers flying everywhere. There was a real curiosity in all of that. Downing Street, I think, was so aware of the potential fun to put it mildly, people could have with the Prime Minister on his knees in front of the US President, that they then told us that the reason the Prime Minister had bent down to pick them up was not because it's the sort of sensible thing to do if the person next to you drops a bit of paper
Or
and they're holding a
instinctive.
file, or instinctive, and they're
Let's
holding,
test that out.
and they're holding a file, and you're the nearest person, and so you just pick down, and you're about to talk about this deal, and you can't do that with the thing blowing around in the wind.
Yeah.
But was to try and claim that it was about the safety of us lot watching on, because if we
You might have got a paper cut.
from
a flag trade deal.
or taken out by Donald Trump's, Secret Service agents. And I thought, and it's one of those things where I thought, very magnanimous to worry about our health and safety. But I thought maybe you could have just said it was a decent thing to do.
One for verify that.
I mean, it's,
yeah.
which is now available as a live blog. Right, let's bring it right back home. And actually, this week in Parliament is shaping up to be quite a sort of week of big moral issues. So a couple of days ago, we had that vote on the amendment to a bill about something else, which ended up decriminalising abortion for women in England and Wales. So a big significant thing, and also a free vote where MPs got to vote however they wanted with their conscience. And then we've got the next stage of the assisted dying legislation on Friday. So Alex, having been at Westminster this week, has it felt that people have been really wrestling with these big moral issues?
Yeah, I think people are conscious of the fact that they are really significant choices that MPs are having to make in a way they don't always. And you're completely right to say, you don't often get these issues come along, and then there are two significant ones in 1 week. I think there are sort of differences between the two. I think, obviously the assisted dying bill has been put forward as a private member's bill and has gone through its own process as a consequence. But the vote on decriminalising abortion for women, so it effectively means that women can't be prosecuted in relation to their own pregnancy. It doesn't change, for example, the 1967 Abortion Act, which sets out the legal framework under which you can have an abortion. It just means that women can't face investigation or prosecution. Now, the slight difference with that was that, as you say, that was tagged on to another bill, the Crime and Policing Bill. And so it only had a couple of hours of discussion in the Commons. Now, that came up during the debate with some people saying that isn't the right way to handle a matter like this, which is known as a matter of conscience or a vote of conscience. Other people were saying, look, this has been around before. There's been plenty of discussion, as you might expect. But I think when you come to these kind of big issues where MPs aren't being whipped along party lines and it comes down to an individual decision that they know could have quite profound consequences for individuals, you kind of feel it when you're in Westminster and talking to the people about that. And immediately after, I was actually in Central Lobby in the House of Commons immediately after the vote on the issue of abortion. And there were people kind of coming out the chamber to talk to us. And, you could sense that it was one of those things that they'd really felt strongly about and had thought about and had made their decision whether they were for or against that particular element of it. And I think the assisted dying vote is going to be exactly the same.
And I think where there's a parallel between the abortion vote and assisted dying is exactly as you said, the way it has come about meant that it's much harder for people to tune in to what the issues are and what the process is and what's going on. It's not like there's a big piece of government comms to make sure everybody understands what's being voted on here or how the law is changing. And you saw quite a lot of misinformation and confusion on the night about what actually MPs had agreed to do.
You absolutely did, and particularly on social media in the case of that vote around abortion, because there were lots of people suggesting that it meant abortion had been legalised up to full term. So just to be really clear, under the terms of the 1967 Abortion Act, abortion is legal up to 24 weeks of a pregnancy in certain circumstances. For example, you need to get two doctors to approve it, and only beyond that in other very specific circumstances. For example, if a woman's life is in danger and other things like that. But the argument that was being put forward by people that wanted the law to change was that there were some cases, and it is a very few cases, where some women were finding themselves in a position where they were terminating pregnancies after that point, and then for whatever reason, and then they would be facing police investigation or prosecution. The argument was women in that situation should be shown compassion, not the possibility of a prosecution. Now, people on the other side, in the course of that debate, made very clear, who didn't agree with this change, that they were concerned about the consequences, because there's also been a recent law change where you can access abortion pills now at home up to 10 weeks after a video or telephone consultation. And they were saying, well, how do those two things work together? If there's not going to be any potentially criminal consequences for the woman, and you can action abortion pills at home. What might that mean? Are women going to get the proper care that they need? So it was a really, in the chamber, I think people understood to a large degree, obviously, what they were discussing and what they were thinking about. But as is often the case then on social media, the way this is interpreted in a few characters or a tweet or whatever else became something quite different. And I think on those big issues where there's a lot of discussion about the kind of the process and the scrutiny, the principles can sometimes get lost afterwards.
And there's a sort of big picture thought just worth pondering, particularly in the context of the understandable attention there is to the international picture at the moment. That if, and it's an if, and let's insert the caveats because there's lots of MPs who haven't declared how they're going to vote and all the rest of it. But broadly speaking, as we record the night before the vote on ending life for those who are terminally ill, those on the pro side who want to see the law changed are more confident of winning than the others. If that comes to pass, this week will mark, it's quite a liberal tilt on two key aspects of social policy, matters of conscience, that Parliament collectively through the individual will of MPs not being instructed how to vote by their parties, because that also applies on this whole question as well, where the collective will of Parliament will have been it's quite a significant step in a liberal direction.
But government is going to have to enact both these things.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, do they really just sort of say, no, it's up to the conscience of Parliament? I mean, surely they have to shape things to make it enforceable, to make it actually enactable as a government in some ways, or do they sort of say, oh no, let's just see what Parliament?
No, they absolutely do. And I think in the case of the abortion vote, the government made clear that they would enact the will of Parliament because it was a matter of conscience, and it was quite a significant majority of people who supported the law change in that instance. I think it's slightly more complicated with the assisted dying because there's obviously been questions about implications.
A new wing at the NHS.
Well, implications for the NHS resources, questions about how that would work for like the Justice Department when they were talking about the role of legal experts. Which has changed slightly. So I think there are certainly slightly different questions when it comes to assisted dying.
I mean, not least the acknowledgement from Kim Ledby to the Labour MP who is driving this change. It's her bill. Earlier in the process, and she didn't want to do this, but felt it was just inevitable that they had to push back the implementation time, the time before this becomes law, because those in government were saying, look, if this does become law, it's going to take quite a while. We need up to 4 years in order to have this up and running, which she wasn't particularly keen on, but had to acknowledge the reality of if this is going to see the light of day in a responsible way.
And Chris, I was just going to say, Chris, just before we go, not to step on the toes of our colleagues at Today in Parliament on Radio 4, but just explain to us the actual bit of the process that is happening on Friday.
So
it's the so-called third reading.
Yeah, it's the third reading, which means, confusingly, the second time that MPs will have voted on the fundamental principles of the bill. So it was introduced back in October. There was a vote in November at the second reading. The first reading of a bill is literally reading out its title. Nothing else happens. Second reading, you get a vote, and it passed with a majority of 55, I think it was.
Yeah.
And after that, it went into what's known as the committee stage, where it is scrutinised, and there's 1,000,001 ideas that are floated. Some are accepted, some are rejected, blah, blah, blah. There's then something called the report stage, and then you get, which we're going to get a bit of tomorrow, then you get third reading, which is then effectively, again, a kind of first principles argument about what the bill now looks like. If, let's underline if, but if it clears third reading, in other words, there is a vote in favour of it, and the expectation is there will be, but with a smaller majority than last time, but again, let's see. It then goes to the House of Lords, and if it passes on Friday, we said this last time, and it was right last time as well, but England and Wales will have taken the biggest step it has ever taken in the direction of this, and will be the biggest single step to suggest it's going to happen that we've had.
And Faisal, I'm sorry we didn't have time to talk about the 10-year infrastructure strategy, but I'm sure we will do it at some point between now and 2035.
Mark your calendar.
Between 8:35.
Well, it's probably actually midnight 35 right now. By the time
we can all go down
this.
that
on a train.
Yes. Right. Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Cheers.
And thanks to you for watching. Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.